Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from, and welcome to our webinar, The State of Firearms Law Database, a resource for researchers studying firearm policies. I'm Erin Hagan, the Deputy Director for Evidence for Action, and I'll be your moderator today. We're excited to bring you this new publicly available comprehensive database that will help facilitate future research exploring which state policies work the best to reduce gun violence and improve population health and well-being. Evidence for Action is a national program of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation committed to developing the evidence base to align with RWJF's vision of building a culture of health across the country. Our mission at Evidence for Action, or E4A, is to support rigorous research examining which strategies are most effective in improving population health, well-being, and equity. Gun violence is increasingly recognized as a public health issue by numerous health organizations. In the United States, more than 30,000 people die from gun violence each year. That's higher than the number of people dying from HIV, hypertension, and many other chronic conditions. Yet gun violence research is substantially underfunded and understudied relative to these and other leading causes of death, largely due to federal restrictions on the use of funds to study gun violence. As a result, there is a lack of evidence available for policymakers to utilize in the development and implementation of effective evidence-based policies to reduce gun violence. That's why this database is so important. We hope that more readily available data will facilitate future research that can inform more effective firearm policy. A unique contribution of this database is the coding methodology employed by Dr. Siegel and his team, which goes beyond simply indicating whether or not a law is in place to identify specific provisions of each policy. This coding nuance is especially important in thinking about the issue of gun violence in the broader context of building a culture of health. It's important that we not just look at gun violence as a criminal problem. If we consider the culture in which we live, taking the views of people who own guns and support gun rights, and not just from the narrow perspective of this as a criminal behavior, we may be able to craft a path forward to break the stalemate and how to approach gun violence. This research is trying to change the paradigm to think of gun violence as a public health problem and understand the underlying gun culture. So today we're joined by Dr. Mike Siegel, a professor in the Community Health Sciences Department of the Boston University School of Public Health. Dr. Siegel will explain the methodology for developing the database and coding schematic, demonstrate how to download data, and use the various functions of the website, and answer your questions. So without further ado, Mike, let me turn it over to you.
Well, thanks, Erin. I appreciate it, and thanks to everyone who is listening. The work that I'm about to describe was funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation under the Evidence for Action program, and the views expressed here do not necessarily represent the views of the foundation. So I want to start out just by talking very briefly about the problem of firearm violence. And although there was a drastic decline in firearm violence during the 1990s, if we actually look at just the last decade, there really has been no further decline in firearm violence. And in fact, the data from 2000 to 2014 to 15 show that there's actually been an uptick during the last year. And in fact, in every single state other than one, there was an increase in the firearm homicide rate from 2014 to 15. This was the largest annual increase that we've seen in the past 35 years. So what has Congress done about this problem? So this is a list of all the laws that Congress has passed during the last 10 years to address this problem. And if you don't see anything, it's not a problem with the webinar. It's that there are none. Congress has not done anything. They've passed no laws in the last 10 years to address this problem. So as Dan Webster and John Vernick point out, states have really become the primary forum for innovation in gun laws, and it's really up to the states to fill the void because there's very little action, if any, at the federal level. So there have been some attempts to describe what types of firearm laws are out there. And this is a little picture from the Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence, where they characterize, using color coding, a variety of different types of firearm laws. And they break it into dark blocks versus hatched blocks to indicate the level of the stringency of the law under that particular category. And then they've actually drawn a graph here, or a picture, that shows the status of all of these different types of firearm laws in all the 50 states. And what I hope you see from this picture is that it is extremely complex and almost impossible to decipher. There are so many different types of firearm laws and so many variations on those laws that it is really kind of a mess. And the problem is that in order to determine which state laws are most effective in reducing firearm violence, we really do need a longitudinal database that characterizes state laws over a long period of time. And prior to this work, there really wasn't such a database in existence. There are good sources for current state laws, but there really is no database that goes over any significant period of time. So, for example, the Brady scorecard, the Brady Center puts out a scorecard every year in which they rate the states on a number of firearm laws. The problem with that is that it just starts in 2007, so you can't go back in time before that. And unfortunately, there's inconsistency in the provisions. They change from year to year, and there's inconsistency in the coding because the laws are not always coded in the same way. So it's difficult to really get a sense of the change over time in these laws. The Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence has an excellent website and has a detailed summary of the current status of laws, and it breaks these laws down into exquisite detail. But again, it's only for current laws, and so you really can't get a picture of changes over time. The NRA itself, through its Institute for Legislative Affairs, they have an excellent website as well that summarizes state laws. But again, it only gives you the current status of laws. It's also quite limited in scope because they're focusing on laws that relate to firearm possession. One of the limitations of all existing databases is that the provisions are not always explicitly defined. So many laws have exemptions. There are differences in the scope of coverage of various laws. There are nuances involved in these laws. And there are differences in the enforcement provisions that apply to these laws. And so what I want to do is kind of give you an example of several laws and show you the problems in each of these categories. So first is exemptions. So for example, there's one law that previously has been categorized as no firearm possession if someone is under 18. But there are exemptions in many of these laws. For example, some of these laws have an exemption for parental consent. So if a parent consents to have their child or their minor carry a gun, there would be an exemption in that individual would be able to possess a firearm. There are also exemptions in many of the state laws for when youth are participating in hunting or recreation activities, or when they're participating in gun safety training exercises. And then there's a further division between whether or not those activities have to be supervised or they can be unsupervised in order for this exemption to take place. Another example of an exemption is universal background checks. So these are laws that require every purchase of a firearm to undergo a background check. But there is something called the Brady exemption, which means that if you're already licensed, in other words, you already have, for example, a concealed carry license, that you wouldn't need to go through the background check again and again every time you purchase a gun. And so if you're coding these laws, how do you code that? Do you include that as counting for a universal background check, or does that not count? Even for something that seems quite simple, like a one gun per month law saying you can only buy one gun per month, there are often exemptions for people who have concealed carry permits. And so again, the question arises, are you going to count those states as having a one gun per month limit or not? There are also differences in the scope of these laws. So for example, there's a provision for whether or not a background check is required for ammunition purchase. Well, there's a difference between coverage for dealers and for private sellers. Some of these laws only apply to dealers, licensed dealers, whereas others apply to all sales. And so the question arises, if a law only applies to dealers, then do they really have required background checks for ammunition purchase, and how are you going to code that? Another example is the law that prohibits people who have committed or who are subject to restraining orders from possessing a firearm. Well, the scope varies across the states. In some states, this only applies to permanent restraining orders, and it doesn't apply to temporary restraining orders. There's also a difference in who's covered. In some states, dating partners are covered. In other states, it only applies to people who are married, previously married, or cohabiting or have previously cohabited or had a child. So dating partners may or may not be covered. The third example is there's a law that basically says that if you've committed a violent crime, even if it's a misdemeanor, you cannot possess a firearm. And so there's a question about the scope of these laws, because in some states, this only applies if the crime that you committed actually involves the use of a firearm. And if you commit any other kind of violent crime, you would not be included. So how do we code something like that? There are also nuances. For example, what do certain terms mean? So we talk about firearm laws such as record keeping. Is there a requirement that dealers keep records? Well, what does that mean? What does it mean to keep a record? And so, if you just collect the person's name and their contact or identifying information, is that enough to count as record keeping? Or do you have to actually record the make and model of the gun? Another example of a nuance is that there are permit requirements in many states. You have to have a permit to purchase a gun. Well, what if a state requires that you have a handgun safety certificate, meaning you have to undergo some sort of training and get a certificate saying that you've gone through that training? Does that count as a permit? It's not a permit per se, and it's not called a permit. Does that count as having a permit requirement? It's an example of some of the nuances. And then finally, there are differences across state laws in terms of the degree of enforcement that's built into the law. So one of the standard laws that many states are passing is that if you are subject to a restraining order, you can't possess a gun. But there are states that basically say that, but they don't actually require that the person surrender or relinquish the guns that they already have. So while technically they're not allowed to possess a gun, there's actually no requirement that they surrender or turn in the guns that they already have. So they can generally keep those guns and without a problem. Even states that do say that you must surrender those laws, in some of those states, the police are not authorized to confiscate weapons. So there's no recourse if a person just decides that they're not going to turn their weapons in. Nobody's watching, and nobody can actually force them to do that. So there's no confiscation. So some states authorize confiscation. Other states actually require that law enforcement confiscate the weapons. And so there's a vast difference in the degree to which states have implemented enforcement provisions, yet those enforcement provisions may make all the difference in the world in terms of whether the law is truly effective or not. So what we did was, with funding from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, we developed a comprehensive database of state firearm laws. It covers 133 different law provisions across 14 categories. It covers all 50 states, and it covers every year starting in 1991 up to the present. It is up to date as of today, and we intend to update it continuously so that it is current at any point in time. Basically, just briefly, the methods we used was that to code 100 of these provisions, we searched each law individually by reading state statutes using Thomson Reuters Westlaw. And we cross-checked our coding with all the previous published data that we could find to verify, and if there were any discrepancies, we went back to the original statute to make sure that we had it correct. We also coded an additional 33 provisions from data that was provided by Everytown for gun safety. And Everytown is itself putting together a similar longitudinal database. They haven't released it yet, but it is very close to being finished. The coding, we basically developed very detailed definitions for each provision, and we used an iterative process. So we started with tentative definitions, and as we went through the laws and identified various nuances or differences, exemptions, differences in scope, we iteratively changed the coding to try to encompass all of those different variations. We trained a group of graduate public health students with 2.5-hour sessions in how to actually use the Westlaw Next database to look up these statutes. And so we had every state coded separately by 3 different people, and then we cross-checked everyone's coding and resolved all the discrepancies collectively so that everyone agreed on the final coding. So how did we deal with exemptions, differences in scope, nuances, and differences in enforcement provisions? We dealt with these issues in one of 2 ways. So one was that we would develop explicit definitions and basically say, here's what is meant by this law provision. And the second way that we dealt with some of the discrepancies was to divide the law into multiple provisions so that we would actually code each of the different variations of the law separately. So you can get an idea of exactly what the situation is with that law. And how do we make the decision of which of these to use? It was really arbitrary and just based on our sense of how important it would be to researchers to really have a breakdown of exactly what the differences in the laws were, or whether it's sufficient to just generally know whether a state has a law or not, and just make sure that we define it clearly enough so that people know what it refers to. So for example, here's how we dealt with some exemptions. So the law that says that there's no firearm possession if you're under 18, we did not allow an exemption for parental consent. So if there was an exemption for parental consent, we basically said that that doesn't count. However, we did allow an exemption if there was, if it was for supervised hunting, recreation, or training of youth. And our rationale here was basically that the parental consent exemption is basically completely watering down the law and means that it absolutely can't be enforced because any youth could simply forge a note saying that they have consent, and that would essentially destroy the intent of the law. Whereas with the hunting, recreation, and training exemption, as long as it's supervised, we didn't really feel that that would be something that would lead to youth committing gun crimes. As far as universal background checks go, we dealt with the Brady exemption by allowing that. We decided that since the person was already licensed and had a background check, that it was reasonable to allow that exemption. And then for the 1 gun per month laws, we decided not to allow concealed carry permit exemption because, again, that would really undermine the purpose of the law. So we realized that some of these judgments were arbitrary and subjective, but in all cases we made it very clear, and there's a code book, which I'll show you later, which explains exactly what the decisions were that we made. Some examples of how we dealt with differences in the scope of laws. So for background checks for ammunition purchase, we only coded those laws as being present if they applied both to licensed dealers and private sellers. For laws that said that you could not possess a firearm if you were the subject of a restraining order, Here what we did was we actually coded all the different variations. We felt that the differences in coverage between whether it applies to permanent restraining orders versus temporary restraining orders and whether it covers dating partners were important enough that we really wanted to have this coded separately for every state. So we created separate provisions for each of those different categories. And then for the law that says that you cannot possess a firearm if you've committed a violent crime in the past, we only counted these as laws. We only counted these laws if they applied to all violent crimes, and if there was a restriction that it only applied to crimes in which a firearm was used, that we did not count that in terms of having that particular law provision. In terms of the nuances, here are two examples of how we handle them. So the record keeping, we basically defined record keeping as a requirement that the retailer or the seller record the name, either the contact information or identifying information for the purchaser, and the make and model of the firearm that was being sold. For the permit requirement, we decided that we would allow a requirement for handgun safety certificates as a permit because it does require the person to go through what essentially amounts to a permitting process. One of the important things that's important to understand about the database was the coding rules that we used. We coded every provision as a 0 or a 1, and what we tried to do was develop the database so a 1 is always a good thing, in quotation marks. In other words, that if you have a provision that's primarily intended to reduce firearm violence as opposed to expanding the use of guns, protecting the gun industry, or preventing local gun regulation, we wanted a 1 to indicate that you had that provision, and a 0 would indicate that you didn't have that provision. But for laws that actually expand the use of guns or protect the gun industry or preempt local regulation, we used a reverse coding. So we actually coded the absence of a law as being a 1 and the presence of a law as being a 0. So the presence of a, quote, bad law, like a stand your ground law or a preemption law, would be coded as, the absence would be coded as a 1 rather than having that law. And part of the reason for this was to be consistent and make it easy to understand, but another reason was so that if you add up the total numbers, it will give you some indication of the total number of provisions that a state has. So before I show you the database, I just want to kind of very quickly show you the total number of law provisions across the different states, because the most striking finding of our research was the striking disparity between states in the number of law provisions. So out of a total of 133 provisions, this is in 1991, you can see that there was a tremendous discrepancy here, from the high being 58 in California and the low being just 3 laws in Montana and in Vermont. So across the states, there was a drastic difference in firearm laws. And then in 2016, again, you can see this drastic difference. The number of laws generally increased, but you can see that the discrepancy widened even more. So now the difference between the highest and lowest is between California, now at 104 laws, and several states, including Montana and Idaho, with just 4 laws. So that discrepancy really, really increased. And this shows you the change in the number of law provisions from 1991 to 2016. And you can see that while there were a small number of states that adopted a substantial number of laws, California adopted 46 law provisions during that time period, Hawaii 40, Massachusetts 45, Connecticut was the top with 62 different law provisions adopted, and Maryland with 47. There were also a large number of states, really almost all the states through this entire region here, except for Colorado, that either adopted only a very small number of laws or actually repealed more laws than they enacted. So Missouri is an example of a state that actually had 9 fewer law provisions in 2016 than they had in 1991. And South Carolina is the same. So now I want to briefly demonstrate the website and show you what the database looks like and what you can, how you can access the data. And this is the website. It's just statefirearmlaws.org. So now, hopefully, I'm sharing the desktop so that you can see our database. So this is the homepage for the State Firearm Law database. And there are 2 main ways that you can search through the data. One is this law data link, and the other is looking state by state. So we'll start with the law data, and we have what we call a visualization and database download. And so this does 2 things. First, there's a map tab. And what the map tab does...
It's Erin.
Yep.
I'm going to stop you for just a second because I think maybe our audience cannot see your screen right now. So I'm wondering if you can try one more time to share. There you go. It was just taking a little longer to load, I think. So now we're on the same page with you. We can see it.
Oh, you can see. Okay, let me go back to the home page since people didn't see that. So this is the home page.
Thank you. Perfect.
And what I was trying to show you was that there were 2 main tabs here, the law data tab and the state by state tab. Those are the main 2 places where you can access the data. So if we start with the law data tab and we go to the visualization and database download. So there are 2 tabs here within this section. First is the map tab. And basically what that does is it shows you a map of the U.S. and it shows you the number of laws out of the 133 law provisions. It will show you how many are present in each of the different states during that particular year. And the year for this map is 2016. But using this slider, you can actually slide to any given year, and it will update and tell you the number of laws that were present during that particular year. And if you're interested only in summarizing the certain types of laws, you can actually look at only certain categories. So if you wanted to know what was going on with, let's look at stand your ground laws. So you could just click on stand your ground, and then this will update. And so now we basically have a map showing us every state that has a stand your ground law or doesn't. So you can see that these lighter states here are all states that have enacted stand your ground laws as of 2009. And if we go back to 1991, when we started the database, you'll see that there were none. None of the states had stand your ground laws back in 1991, and so you can kind of track the change over time. You can also break it down by subcategory. For example, if you wanted to look at background checks, and then let's actually look at fire regulations. Okay, so if we click on bioregulations, you can actually go to a subcategory. And let's say you're just interested in age restrictions. You can just click on age restrictions, and now it will map just the number of provisions that each state has in terms of the age restrictions. Then we have a table under the table mode, and what this will do is allow you to filter by state, by year, by category, by subcategory, and even by specific provision, and examine and display the whole data set. So what we've got here, the default is basically 2017, every state and every regulation. So essentially this is our database. And you can, if you scroll down, you'll see each state for 2017, and as we scroll down, you'll see that we've got actually, okay, this is just the year 2017. So you're basically seeing all the laws, and then going across, you're seeing each of the different provisions and what they're coded for in 2017, and at the end, you have the total number of laws for this year. The place where you would download the database is here. So you can download the database as a text file, comma separated value file, or an Excel spreadsheet. And this will download the whole database. If you only want to download part of the database, you can do that using these filters. And then you can download the filtered selection. So if you click on one of these links here, it will just download what's displayed visually that you can see that you filtered. If you download one of these links, it will download the entire database. The second way you can look at the data is state by state. And so the state by state pages allow you to choose any state that you want. And using the year tab down here, you can also choose any year that you want. And you can see a list of all the number of provisions that were in place in that state in that year, along with each of the different specific provisions that was in place and what its current status is. So you can see that in 2008, Alabama actually had 11 provisions. These are the 11 provisions that they had, and without even going to the 2017 link, you can see that these 3 provisions, or these 4 provisions here, are still in place, whereas all of these other ones have subsequently been repealed. We also have the firearm homicide rate and the firearm suicide rate for each state in each of the years. So that's what the state-by-state pages will allow you to do. Now, if you want to know what the categories are, we have an About the Categories page in which you can look up any particular category, and it will give you a definition of what that category means and a little bit of the background, and then it will list the specific provisions that are included in that category. So if you wanted to know what we mean by background checks, it gives you the definition, a little bit of background, and then it tells you what the specific provisions are that are being tracked in that category. So this is how you can find a particular category and figure out if you're looking for a specific provision, what category is that provision in. Let's see. What I want to show you next is the database, not the database, the code book. So if you click on Law Data, it will allow you to actually download the code book. And so this will download an Excel spreadsheet, which hopefully will open here and I can show you what the code book looks like. So this is the code book, and basically what it gives you is, first it gives you the category, and these are color-coded so that all the provisions within a given category are the same color, and they also have a number by them. So the first category is dealer regulations. These are all regulations that deal with regulation of licensed dealers. Then buyer regulations. These are provisions that regulate the purchase of guns. Then we have prohibitions for high-risk gun possession, such as alcohol use, drug use, mental health, background checks, ammunition regulations, possession regulations, concealed carry permitting, assault weapons and large capacity ammunition regulation, child access prevention, gun trafficking laws, preemption laws, immunity statutes, and then finally domestic violence related provisions. And for each provision, it gives you the category and then a subcategory, and then it gives you the actual variable name and a brief description of the provision along with a more detailed description of the nuances in that provision. Some of them are pretty straightforward. This one is a state dealer license is required, so basically that's pretty straightforward. But some of them get a little more complex. So here, for the record keeping, we explained exactly what we meant by the records, which I had described to you earlier. Then we have coding notes, which are notes to help explain some of the subtleties of our coding that we just wanted to make clear. And then finally, we have the specific coding instructions that our coders used. And so this will tell you in great detail exactly what the rules are that we followed in doing this coding. So if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty of a particular provision, this is definitely somewhere you can look at to really understand exactly how we coded the laws. We provide notes for some of the statute provisions, and then finally the data source. So this is this will hopefully be useful if you are interested in doing research with the database and you want to have the variable names so that you can link them to the provision and understand in the actual database, which when you download it will be a Excel spreadsheet, exactly what these various variable names refer to. So I think the last thing I want to show is just the actual database. So we'll go to the database download tab, the table tab, and let me actually open up the database in Excel. So here is the database. So you can see that we have each of the 50 states here, and it's just by year. So we have 91, 92, 93, and this will go all the way down to 2017. So it's pretty straightforward. And then we have each of the 133 provisions going across the columns, and everyone is coded as either a 0 or a 1. So you can just go across, and I believe these are in alphabetical order going across, so you can find what each variable is, how it's coded, and then the total is here in the last column. And these variable names are in the coding, the code book, which I just showed you. So if you aren't sure what it means by waiting, you would look up in the code book and see that that refers to whether or not there's a waiting period before the purchase of a gun. So at this point, I want to open it up to any questions, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that people have.
Great. Thanks so much, Mike. This is so helpful and comprehensive, and all along the way of your development, I've gotten to see progress you've been making, and even I'm still learning new things today as you're going through it. So, to that note, I do wonder if you have plans for or the ability to offer researchers any sort of technical assistance who may be trying to use the database. We will post this webinar on our website so people can review this tutorial, which I think will be really great, but wondering if you have that capacity internally to offer people any assistance as they're trying to use the database and getting used to it.
Well, yes, absolutely. I'm available, and any members of our research team will also be available to take people through this and answer questions that people have. Whether it involves using the website or accessing the database, or even if it has to do with understanding how we coded certain provisions, we're happy to talk to anyone and to run through everything with them. So that's absolutely, we're very happy to do that and to have an interaction with researchers.
Fantastic. I'm sure that will be really helpful to people. So I want to say to our audience, if you have questions, we'd love to hear from you. Just type them into the chat feature in the ReadyTalk system, and I can relay them on to Mike. In the interim, while you're thinking about questions you may have, I have a couple other questions for you, Mike. So there are so many possibilities of research that could be done with this database, especially because it's data that hasn't been readily accessible for people before. It's so comprehensive. It's historical and current. And so I'm wondering if you can share some additional ideas of research projects you think will be are especially timely, either due to the policy landscape or pertinent because the data is just now available in the way that you've coded it. So just some ideas you have about future research, and I know that that even the research you have planned with your team, there's still many more possibilities of the sort of analyses that could be done, and so what you think might be the most exciting opportunities.
Yeah, so I mean, one thing about the firearm research field is that there really is very limited research out there. So there's plenty of opportunity and actually a need for multiple researchers to be doing research on these laws, and in fact, even to have multiple researchers researching the same type of law, because there's so little out there that it's not repetitive or redundant at this point, and it really does help to have multiple sources confirming the same result if that's the case. So in that sense, you know, all of these areas are important. In terms of kind of coming up with some of the priorities based on current, you know, the current national picture and the trends that we've seen, I think one thing that's particularly important at this time is the whole area of concealed carry, permitting processes, and their impact on firearm violence. The federal government is now considering a concealed carry reciprocity law, which would basically mean that if someone has a concealed carry permit in any of the 50 states, they would be allowed to carry that weapon concealed in any other of the 50 states. And there's a question about whether that would actually increase people's safety or decrease people's safety. In fact, you know, I think that the primary debate out there, academic debate, in the research community, which of course has crept its way into the political debate as well, is does a greater prevalence of guns protect people, or does it actually increase risk for violence? And there's a lot of conflicting research. So I think that this database could be very useful to helping to answer that question by looking at the concealed carry permitting processes, the differences across the states, and tying that to changes in firearm violence rates. So that's one particular priority I think that's important. A second one is the domestic violence laws, and the reason I mention that is that that's the area where we've actually seen the most growth in these laws, even in states that don't have a lot of other firearm laws. So more than half of the states actually have domestic violence provisions in place. But there's a big variation in terms of the enforcement. So I think the second area that is really important to explore is how do variations of enforcement of these laws affect the potential impact on firearm violence. And so I guess the third priority would be looking at other types of laws with the same question, is do the enforcement provisions, or does the strength of the provision affect the effectiveness of the law? And that's an area where there's been very, very little, if any, work. We really don't have an understanding of you know, whether it matters how these laws are enforced, what the scope is, how much it covers, so whether there are exemptions. So I think those are all areas that I would view as a priority for research. But again, there's so much here that any research that people do looking at the relationship between these laws and public health outcomes would be incredibly helpful and would make a huge contribution.
Yeah, I totally agree, and especially this point you're making about enforcement. I think that's the case certainly for firearm laws and really laws in all areas. It's so important to think about whether or not enforcement is written into the law, and then ultimately how it's actually being enforced, and who's given the authority to carry out enforcement, et cetera. So really important questions. And again, I think one of the contributions that this database is making is going beyond just whether or not there's a law and looking into those provisions around enforcement. And to your point earlier about all this, including all the states and consistent coding across states, it seems like research could be done at the national level, or it could be done at the state level, or even comparative across states. Is that right about how you might be able to slice and dice the data?
Yeah, absolutely. We broke it down by state, but you could certainly look at national trends as well, and see whether there's been a general impact on national rates of firearm violence. I think the thing that is most conducive to answering these questions is the fact that there is so much variation between the states. It's in research, it's tough to find effects or to evaluate effects when you don't have a lot of variation because you're looking for very small differences. But here, the variation is extreme, and so it really lends itself to an attempt to kind of ask the question of, well, why is one state so different from another, and what are the factors that influence that, and what are the implications of that for violence rates? So the fact that there is such a drastic difference between the states means that there must be some pretty dramatic differences in other variables that might explain the differences in violence rates. So I think it kind of opens the door to start the process of answering these questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned, you actually did quite a nice job of explaining during your presentation the limitations that just naturally occur with the data itself and sort of the differences among laws and the nuances within the policies. And I just was wondering if there are any limitations or considerations that researchers should really be keeping in mind or being careful of when using the database itself or linking with other data that's related to the way the database is developed and how you might link that data externally. If there are any advice you might give to other researchers to just be aware of as they're linking this data to other data sources and using the database in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the most important limitation that needs to be kept in mind is that we don't necessarily know whether these laws work or not, and we don't know whether certain provisions are important or not. And so we've just, to a large extent, we're just kind of guessing. We're using kind of common sense to try to figure out what we think is important to track and what is not. And so there are two limitations to that. The first is that we may have made the wrong decisions. We may have made decisions that aren't accurate. So there may be provisions that we aren't tracking that are important, and there certainly may be provisions that we are tracking that are not important. And so definitely I would want others to keep that in mind. Secondly, it's important to recognize that it's not necessarily the case that you can just add up these numbers and get a sense of the strength of the laws. Because again, some of the laws really may not have much of an impact, and it may be the case that one or two particular laws have a very strong impact. So simply adding the numbers may not give an accurate indication of the actual strength or effectiveness of laws in a state. We provided this data because you need to start somewhere and you need to have the information. But I think it will be interesting and important for other researchers to try to look at what laws are important, and is there a threshold where you have to have a certain number of laws before you see an effect? Are there certain laws that have an effect and others that don't? Is there a way that we can weight the laws to kind of create an index of the strength of gun regulation? So I guess I wouldn't want researchers just to take these numbers and automatically assume that a 25 is better than a 23. That's the main caveat that I would put out there.
Yeah, definitely important. So we do have a question from the audience, and related to another question that I was going to ask you. So, I know that one of the comments you just made is that this is the first stage of this research. So it was building the database, and now it's time to use the database to do research. And so wondering if you want to talk at all about any early trends or learnings that you have from along the way, and then more specifically, ideas you have about using the related research from the database for advocacy purposes, which at Evidence for Action, ultimately informing decision-making and priority setting and allocation of resources is the goal of the research we fund. So if you want to talk a little bit about sort of the next steps in terms of the early learnings and how you might use ultimate research findings for advocacy purposes.
Sure. So I think some of the early things that we've learned from just putting together the database is a couple of things. I mean, first, the tremendous discrepancy between states. Second, the discrepancy in the change in the number of laws over time. And so it appears that the states that started out with very few laws have not adopted very many laws during this time period. And the states that already started with a lot of laws have adopted many laws. So it essentially we have this kind of complete demarcation with this huge disparity that's increasing over time. And that's important because in public health we don't just look at trying to decrease absolute rates of disease or death, but we also want to reduce disparities, racial disparities, geographic disparities, gender disparities. And so we don't want to just see this continue where we have certain states that are taking action to deal with the problem, and then we may see lower violence rates in those states, but other states are just getting worse and worse. So I think that has important implications. The second trend that we noticed is that there is an increasing trend of laws that are actually increasing the scope of where guns can be carried and easing the ability of getting guns and carrying guns. Stand your ground laws that allow people to use guns in self-defense without a requirement that they retreat if they feel that their life or safety is threatened. For example, there are 9 states now that don't require permits at all to carry concealed weapons, and a 10th one that we're tracking right now because they're considering legislation that we'll find out in the next 2 weeks whether they enact it or not. But I think that it's important to look at those laws to see whether or not they have an impact on violence. And some would argue that they're actually going to reduce violence because there are more people walking around who can, protect people from criminals who have guns, or that this might deter violence. And there are others who say that it actually, by having more guns out there, it's going to result in more gun violence. So we don't really know that, and I think answering that question is going to be important. In terms of using this for advocacy, my experience in the tobacco control movement, where I've done a lot of research, is that data on the effectiveness of public health policies plays a really major role in helping policymakers make decisions about enacting laws, what laws to enact. And it also is important in the advocacy process because it's really important to be able to advocate for policies based on evidence of their actual effectiveness rather than just kind of a hypothetical feeling that this law is going to work. And So I think that ultimately the thing that will be most useful about having this database is that it will allow rigorous research to be done, looking at what is the impact of various laws, and then that evidence can be used by different groups to advocate for certain policies, especially if there are certain policies that are found to be particularly effective. And I think in addition, it's not just a question of advocating for stronger laws, but advocacy groups need to know what laws are most effective, because we can't get everything enacted. Obviously, there are political barriers and there are limits to what can be done, and there need to be priorities. Public health advocates and groups need to have priorities of what are the most important policies. And I think this research could potentially help to identify not just is a law effective, but looking across the myriad of laws that are out there, what laws seem to be the most important, and how should we prioritize various policies?
Such great points, and we're approaching the top of the hour, so probably great points to close with. And at Evidence for Action, we are really support and believe in evidence-based policies and programs. And so we think this database will stimulate the research to build the evidence base that's needed for more effective firearm policies. And so it's been so great to hear about the work up to this point, and to look forward to the research that's coming. I also just want to let people know, or remind people again, that your website with the database is statefirearmlaws.org, and there's also information on our website, evidencefораction.org, which has links to your website and a journal in the American Journal of Public Health, a journal article in the American Journal of Public Health, as well as a brief interview that you've done, and other resources that are related to this work, and we'll continue to update those resources as new evidence comes out of this work. I also want to let people know that this webinar will be archived on our website in the next few days, so if you need to revisit the tutorial, as well as a webinar that Mike did last week with Mighty Fine from the American Public Health Association that was a little more specifically focused on advocacy efforts with this data. And so if you're interested in learning more about the advocacy activities that might accompany this research, I would encourage you to check out that webinar as well. I want to thank our audience, and Mike, thank you for joining us and for providing this really robust and important tutorial, and for your ongoing work in this critical public health area.
And thank you very much for the opportunity to share this with others.